who is God? Does he exist? Has he communicated with humans? And then we have to deal with the implications. So what does it mean to be all-knowing? That's really what our questions start to derive from. We started with this idea of the laws of logic. And in the first one, we have this law of identity. Now, in the law of identity, we have to have the knowledge to be able to identify things. We go out and we identify this microphone and the screen and all these things. But what we're looking for is the greatest conceivable being. We're looking for a being we term God. The greatest conceivable being should know everything. What does that mean? I mean, we start to get into the particulars and then we're like, well, does that mean the universe is fated to be? Does that mean we have no free will? And we get into all these different types of things to debate. But when I talk about this, I want to we're searching for the greatest conceivable being to answer our questions. We're trying to determine which religion might be true and if God is spoken in reality. So I want to go back again and do something at a high level. I don't want to get into the minutia of the implications of what it means to be all-knowing. I want to talk about how could a being be, and is that rational? That's what I really want to know. And when I was searching for God, those are the questions that I started to grapple with. Therefore, to be the greatest conceivable being, you have to be all-knowing. You have to be able to identify everything, death and the future and all these things. So how could that happen? How could God, or the greatest conceivable being, have all knowledge? As I put in my previous one, I see three primary ways that I think you could do that. There is the being option, there's the time option, and then there's the presence option. So there's the being option. And that one is basically the concept is the universe is God. The universe is a being with some type of either intellect or working itself out or manifestation. So we're all part of God. And this being is working itself out and it's growing and changing. I mean, I like the concept. This is the universe, and I can touch it. And when I touch all this different types of stuff, it has almost a mystical quality because all part of God particles, and I'm a manifestation of God. But there's a couple of problems. I mean, God could be all-knowing and know everything inside of itself. That would be akin to me, and I could just know everything about myself if I could somehow just know everything. And the big issue I see is related to time. Like, if I were to look at myself and determine who I am, I can't stop time. And so every moment that I'm trying to examine myself, I'm changing. Something's moving. And so to really identify it, it's kind of like a subatomic particle. We have a hard time identifying the position because it's always moving, and it's moving so fast, we can't identify the change. For God to be the greatest conceivable being, but to be the being option and know everything inside of us, it could know everything inside of itself. But does it know everything? Would the being who has all knowledge of itself inside of itself know the future? Does the universe know what it's becoming? So the being of the universe to know what it's becoming would have to be outside of itself. Like, I don't really know what I'm becoming. I experience things moment to moment and I change from moment to moment, but I don't know where I'm going to be in 5 years or 10 years. I don't know who will be alive. I don't know if I'll have this house. I don't know any of these things. And so a universe that's a being is much akin to a human. To really be all-knowing, to know the future is one of the parts of all-knowing. And if not, then it doesn't know everything. It only knows from moment to moment. It can remember the past, but to know what it's becoming, it would have to be outside of itself and to be able to see itself. And so even though this being would be all-knowing, it only knows itself. It doesn't know outside of itself. Maybe it has some ability to look outside of itself, and so maybe there would be other universes out there, right? And each of these universes would be their own being. So it would be all-knowing about itself, but it wouldn't be all-knowing about these other universes. So it's not the greatest conceivable being. That's why people always ask, well, where did God come from? Where'd the universe come from? What's outside of God? Because we have this concept of a universe as a being, and almost like a human. But it's nice. We can wrap our minds around it. We can understand that type of being. Yeah, it's all-knowing. Yeah, it knows everything inside of itself. But it's really not all-knowing. It makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves. I mean, I'm kind of God particles. This being, yeah, it might know a lot, but doesn't know everything. It's a nice theory. It's a nice option. But to me, in my mind, it's not the greatest conceivable being. I can conceive of something greater. So what would that greater something be? The second option that I see to have all knowledge is what I call the time option. It would be a being who's timeless. It would be a being that can see the past, present, and future and move among those times like we move among space. This is three-dimensional space, and I'm moving back and forth, and I'm free. I can do this. At this moment, this being could just look at this moment, and it'd be like on pause, like, look at everything. Go around and they examine every single thing. Time doesn't matter, so they can know everything because they can examine every single event incessantly, eternally, without end. Seems maybe a little boring. I mean, time is everything. You're everywhere and know everything of all times. Does this mean that God determines everything? I mean, if you think of a being who can move through time in the past, present, and future, we become scared. I become scared. Because that means that this being could go and mess up my past. Would I even know if my past was messed up and suddenly changed? I wouldn't know. Maybe I'm the 14th iteration of myself. I don't know. But this being would know, because this being, time is fluid for this being. Time doesn't really matter to this being. This just completely blows my mind. If you go to againstallheresy.org, I have 5 videos referenced and 4 articles that you can go read about omniscience, and they go into this great detail and really work through some of the philosophy. And I'm not a philosopher by trade, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night during college. That's when I stayed in the Holiday Inn Express. No, so but I did take philosophy courses, and I was challenged with these ideas, and even though I didn't understand and go through the deep philosophy of each of these subjects, my goal is to understand the arguments and then decide which ones are most logical and which ones are most true. And the idea of God as the greatest conceivable being really resonated with my mind. It made sense. But the idea that the greatest conceivable being must exist, I think that that's a leap in logic that I didn't think was reasonable. But I thought, in terms of a mental exercise of what does the greatest conceivable being look like to our minds, and then see if that being spoke, made much more sense. And that's what I'm doing here. The third option I call the presence option. And the presence option can fit with the first one as a being option or with the time option. So to be all-knowing, you could be yourself and look inside yourself and know everything. Or you could be outside of whatever it is you're examining. Or you could be everywhere inside what you're examining. So this is the omnipresence argument, so that God is everything, everywhere around me and everywhere around us, potentially everywhere inside of us, or has some type of X-ray vision like Clark Kent and Superman. And all this information is being fed back to its prodigious, amazing mind that's able to process something much more massive than any computer we could ever imagine. It's present everywhere and it's processing all this information. Okay, again, mind blown. Whether that is the omnipresent, it's everywhere present, and it's a being present everywhere in our universe, and that would kind of make sense. I mean, we'd be like, we're part God stuff, all that. Or it could be the timeless being God, where the universe is not God and it's a creation or something that the greatest conceivable being made, but it is everywhere inside of its own creation, and it's also outside of its creation, and it's looking in, and it is in it. It's this idea of this, like, let's say I could somehow say that I'm God. I'm this being that's timeless, and there's nothing else outside of me. And I make this universe everywhere. I have all these little tendrils and fingers inside this universe, and I can examine it from the outside, but yet I'm still inside it at the very subatomic particle, and I'm everywhere. But because I can stop it right now, examine everything. And then a second later, nanosecond later, I examine everything. But I also see it as a big linear process, right? So each of those nanoseconds are like a big log line here that I'm examining, and I can move here, and I can go down over here, and I can go to what they perceive as the future, and I'm over here, and I'm examining all these things, and I say, I don't like this here, and I want this to happen here, and it branches off, and I go, okay, I like this up here, and this is how I want, and I'm going to slice off this line, or this line continues, and it's all here. It becomes this big old web that's all around me, but because I'm timeless, I can examine this whole web, and I know everything, and I know all these permutations of the past, present, and future. It's this concept of being present everywhere. And this idea of all knowledge as a presence would fit with either the being option of all-knowing or the timeless option. The question is could you have all three? Maybe you could have the being option with the timeless option, but it would seem like if it was an extension of God, then God is bound to time somehow. So you could have maybe a combination. So these are the three options that I considered when I was examining what does it mean to be all-knowing. Implications of these three ideas is not what I want to focus on at this point. So the first thing we have to determine is, who is God? Does he exist? Has he communicated with humans? And then we have to deal with the implications. I can argue all day against certain Christian or Buddhist or Hindu philosophies, but I need to know what I first believe and what I think is true. So if I become an atheist and I say, no, God's never existed, then why even worry about any of this? Many people when they're searching for God, they get trapped in the swamp, the minutia, the small little thing that throws them off track because they get angry or upset, or they don't like a certain type of teaching that religion or that philosophy that it teaches, rather than understanding if it's true or not. If I'm going to make a declaration that I believe that the Christian God is correct, then aren't I subject to everything that the Christian God teaches and says? And if I don't believe part of what that teaching says, what does it say about my belief in that God? Really says I don't really believe what that God's saying. If I was a Hindu and I say, well, yeah, I believe this part of it, but I don't believe this part of it. Are you really a Hindu? If you say, yeah, I'm a Muslim, but I really don't believe that Muhammad, did all these things. Are you really a Muslim? Are you really one who submits? Understanding if that religion is true and what it teaches is paramount. But first I wanted to know what is the greatest conceivable being? And that's where we are at now. So now, next step was, do these make rational sense? We're in the laws of logic, and we're looking at the law of identity. Could a being exist who has these attributes? Could a being be all-knowing? The quick answer is yes. A being could be all-knowing. Could a being be all-knowing with the three types that I've outlined? Yes. Could be a being who's all-knowing about everything inside yourself. You could be a being who is timeless. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, blows my mind, but could be true. Could a being be present everywhere, be omnipresent? Yes. So those can be logically true. They can be rationally true. That's also part of what we're doing here. Part of these steps is to make sure it's reasonable and logical and rational. It might be beyond our complete understanding. I can't wrap my mind around a timeless, omnipresent being. I can wrap my mind around a all-knowing being that's the universe. If we had a being that was all-knowing, that was the being option, the being is the universe, I term this being the lesser God, or the lesser all-knowing being. To me, that being is not the greatest conceivable being because there's something outside of that being. Whereas the being that would be timeless and omnipresent would be the greatest conceivable being. That being would be everywhere. It's outside of the universe, and so the question then becomes is what is outside of this being? And the answer would be this being just is. That being just exists. Our mind rebels at that concept of an infinite, non-defined being. I mean, everything we says, a being has definition. It has physical location. It's what this is. It has physically defined space. To have a being that doesn't necessarily have a physically defined space and just exists, it's inconceivable. We can't get our mind around it. Our mind just keeps going out and out and out. We're like, when are we getting to the end? When are we getting to the end? Is it the end yet? Are we there yet? What's outside of you? If I try to conceive of this being, I become frightened. A timeless being who exists in my past, present, and future, who is eternal and has no end or beginning, and is present everywhere, I get scared. My mind rebels at such a concept. But you know what? That's the greatest conceivable being. But if that being is true, that's the real question. If you watch my previous video, on one slide I showed basically a yin and a yang, right? I showed this idea, what you see in Taoism, that there's this back and forth of, whether it's good versus evil or negative energy and positive energy. And these two things are always kind of going back and forth. And they're always kind of in this ever-ending kind of conflict and cycle. I suggest that there's only one being, that you can't have two of those beings. Because to be all-knowing, truly all-knowing, you have to know what every being knows or is thinking. To be omnipresent means you're everywhere, which means if you had a yin and a yang, the yin would have to exist where the yang exists, and the yang would have to exist where the yin exists, and they would have to know what each other knows. So you could get two all-knowing, all omnipresent beings, but it becomes one being. I find this really interesting in a couple different ways. The first way, and what I was thinking about, is how in certain religions, Buddhism, Taoism, this idea that we become part of this universal consciousness. We become all-knowing, and to be all-knowing, you really kind of have to be everywhere, and you kind of go into this universal mind. And so, the thought is if you become part of this universal mind, do you maintain any sense of your own existence? Are you still separate, but yet you're still part of this being? So everyone just knows your mind, and you know everybody else's mind, and you know everything that's going around in this universe, and you're part of it. But you can't act independently of these other beings that are there. Because they know what you're going to do. They know the future. You know the future. So that's one concept if you had a timeless being, if you had the greatest being. So the other one that I was thinking, though, about was the Christian concept of the Trinity, where if you said that you had three, let's call them persons, right? Because that's what we would be. We'd be a person that was all-knowing and omnipresent, that they would be one being. So just based on philosophical understanding of this idea of a timeless, omnipresent being, if you have three persons that are omnipresent and omniscient, they know everything and they are everywhere, they are one being. If they're timeless, they're one being. They would exist in a state of, again, mind blown. But when I became a Christian, this concept really actually wasn't hard for me to grasp. It was just kind of like, well, that makes sense. It's beyond our understanding, but it's not beyond reason and it's not beyond logic. The question is how does that work out? How does that work out? Maybe God, the greatest conceivable being, is unique and beyond the model that we can understand. And maybe part of the reason he's let so much time elapse before he's done things is so that we do start to understand who he is and what he's doing in this world and universe. And he's let us run rampant with our philosophies and our speculations. And over time, he's revealed a little bit more about himself. Can you imagine when humans began and creation began, and he tried to come down and explain? I mean, really, do you really understand who your parents are when you're 2 years old? When you're 3? When you're 4? When you're 16, do you understand your parents? I mean, really, even when you're 30 or 40, do you really understand your parents? I mean, I understand my spouse pretty well. Been married for almost 30 years. Well, there's still things that she does that kind of shock me, and I'm sure I do things that shock her. It takes us a while to really understand another person, another being, another individual. How much more for the greatest conceivable being? What does it mean to be all-knowing? God's allowed us to have time to speculate and philosophize, philosophicalate, something like that. All-knowing, rational? Yes. Easily understandable? No. This video was meant to help individuals, though, work through the greatest conceivable being when we go to search for God. So that when we go to search for the communications from God, what are we looking for? So I'm looking for a timeless, omnipresent being. Maybe that being is all-knowing also because they exist everywhere in this world and exist as a being. Possible. It's not the greatest conceivable to my mind, but certainly possible. But the being should be all-knowing. Should know everything about everything inside this universe. Death. Where is this realm of death? I really appreciate you taking the time to watch. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hey, if you have any other thoughts or ideas of how a being could be all-knowing, other than the being option, the timeless option, or the presence option, hey, drop a comment in the comments below. Shoot me an email. Like, subscribe if you like this content. If you're enjoying these videos, please join me for my next set of videos where we'll talk about the law of identity and the law of change, which is a big hiccup and stumbling block for many people. I'm really excited about some of those videos and that discussion. So again, thank you for joining me. I'm Colon Wright. This is The Search for God. Take care. Peace. Shalom, shalom, and God bless.